Okay, so I'm going to read this off. Here is my very best attempt at a very brief and very neutral explanation of what is going on in Peru right now. It is still not particularly short, so buckle up. Let me start by saying that I grew up in Peru, in the Cusco region, where I have lived permanently again since 2018. I'm not a journalist or political analyst, just a person who lives here, and I'm just trying to state the facts as neutrally as possible because this is a kind of volatile situation. A really deep understanding of the political situation here would cover around 60 years of Peruvian history at a minimum, and I will not be doing that. I'm just going to try to go over a surface-level view of some recent events. The politics of race and class in Peru are also complicated, as they are everywhere in Latin America, and these can be challenging things to speak to as well, so please bear that in mind. I am trying to be brief and neutral. Peru is a republic with a lot of social divides, many of them along perceived racial and class lines, and many of them along the lines of urban versus rural dwellers. Close to half of Peru's population lives in Lima, the capital, and there's a lot of frustration in provinces or regions other than Lima when it comes to the perception that Lima controls politics and resources. The Constitution dates to 1993, so it will turn 30 this coming year. This can mean that not everything about it has been hashed out extensively in courts yet, and some people believe it's functioning as intended, while others believe that it is flawed and permits too much corruption to dominate politics at every level from local to national. Contrasts between haves and have-nots can be extremely stark. In the 1990s, a wave of neoliberalism dominated Peruvian politics, and many things were privatized, and not everybody agrees that doing so was a general benefit to the nation. This could be said to be a fundamental difference between people on the right who feel privatization is good and people on the left who feel that it has created more corruption and inequality. There's a lot more that can be said about all of this. That is a very, very trimmed down statement, and it can cause tempers to run very high, and it can attract a lot of argument, which is counter to the purpose of just trying to generally create a neutral understanding of what the events are at the moment, December 2022, in Peru. Okay, so in the 1990s, Peru famously was governed by Alberto Fujimori, who originated the autogolpe, or self-coup, in which a regime presently in power, but potentially about to lose it, seizes further power and solidifies their rule by means that are potentially not strictly constitutional, or maybe outright unconstitutional and illegal. You can look him up and read more about him in general. In 2016, Alberto's daughter Keiko ran for president on a platform similar to her father's and appealing to the more right-wing voters who are generally from the more moneyed classes. She narrowly lost a runoff to Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, or PPK, who ultimately left the presidency in 2018. And at that point, his vice president, Martin Vizcarra, took office according to the routine rules of succession, which would normally have the vice president serve out the remainder of the term of a president who leaves office via whatever means, whether that is death or impeachment or stepping down. So a major complaint that essentially everybody in Peru has with government at every level is that there is a lot of corruption, which takes the form of graft, embezzlement, and shady deals, often with foreign companies involving government contracts to do things like work on infrastructure. And all of this can essentially cause a lot of gridlock, legislatively speaking. So anyway, Vizcarra faced an arguably obstructionist Congress, and as it happens in 2019, he followed the constitutional procedures to close Congress and call for new congressional elections, and a brand new Congress was elected and started to serve in 2020. It's 3 or 4 months to be able to call a new election for a brand new Congress per those terms. That's worth Googling and reading up on. And also I'll tell you where in the comments on this you can read this with links. Anyway, so the above is important to understand. Everything I just said is important to understand because if you sort of click through and you look for a lot of information about that, you can read about the circumstances under which the executive branch, led by the president, can close Congress and call for new congressional elections. It is not, however, constitutional for a president to close Congress just because they're trying to impeach him, and we'll come back to that later. So anyway, we should talk a little bit more about Keiko Fujimori, who has served time for money laundering and other corruption charges, and she faces further legal charges as well. And you might think that this would prevent someone from running for president, but the truth is it does not. So that's worth looking at links about her as well. Vizcarra had a pretty clear mandate to work for constitutional reform and legislative reform in hopes of reducing the types of corruption scandals that had been going on. News in English at the time that he closed Congress in 2019 was often very alarmist and not deeply informed. So this is one of those things that comes across differently depending on the context that you're hearing about it in. Anyway, a new Congress was elected in January of 2020, and things didn't really move forward as much as anybody might have hoped, because in March 2020, Peru entered a state of emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which largely the population felt Vizcarra handled about as well as possible. But he was charged in some other conspiracy type things and corruption scandals, and there was a whole lot of stuff that went down surrounding all of that. And in late 2020, the newly elected Congress voted to impeach Vizcarra, which in this case means remove him from office. So he faced impeachment efforts more than once, but ultimately in late 2020, he was removed from office. So per the rules of succession, because he was already a previous vice president and serving out the term of PPK, which would have ended in 2021, this meant that the rules of succession took effect, and the then president of Congress, a guy named Manuel Merino, took office as president. But there were huge protests, and two protesters were killed, and so he only spent 5 days, maybe 6 days, depending on how you count a day, in office before he stepped down. And he was replaced in turn by a guy who had hopes of running for president but had to put those aside to take office, named Sagasti. And Sagasti served as a transitional president until the regularly scheduled elections in 2021, which would have been the elections, at the end of the 5 years that PPK would have served, except for how that didn't happen. So anyway, I think there were 19 candidates, and none of them got the percentage of votes required to outright win the election. So it went to an automatic runoff between the top two candidates, who were Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Castillo. Castillo had skyrocketed to popularity in rural and indigenous and less wealthy regions of Peru, largely in the south of Peru, based on his performance in the presidential debates. And so the runoff was between him and Keiko. Castillo narrowly won, and the vote breakdown was very much along class and region lines. Lima went for Fujimori, and the south of Peru and rural Andean areas for Castillo. From the beginning, Castillo's government faced strong opposition from Congress and other political forces, and he didn't have a whole lot of really strong support because his win could largely be considered a rejection of Fujimori rather than true backing for his left-wing platform. He also didn't have a very strong team from his fairly young party, and he himself had no experience to speak of in government. I would say that generally speaking, nobody thought that Peru Libre, his party, or Castillo, were going to win. They thought that this other guy, Johnny Lescano, was the most likely second person who would be in the runoff with Keiko, and so it was a big surprise. So all of this being said, he did have a very strong support from a large segment of the indigenous and rural populations and voters in areas that had long felt underserved by national government, even when there were people of indigenous descent and backgrounds who were in office as president. So anyway, these areas where he had a lot of support would include regions like where I grew up and where I live here in Cusco. The divisions among voters were extraordinarily stark in that election in 2021. Castillo's supporters see him as having never really been given a chance to govern due to an obstructionist Congress and multiple attempts, even from his first week in office, to impeach him and remove him from office. It was always very unlikely that Castillo would serve a full 5-year term, and hey, nobody had done so in kind of a while anyway. So people who did not support Castillo didn't support him for a number of reasons, some of which are really valid and some of which are maybe less valid. But race and class definitely do figure into the larger picture, maybe not on an individual level, but like in the larger picture. So even while individual non-supporters have lots of other reasons that they didn't support him, so in any case, there was already a motion in progress to impeach him and remove him from office with a vote slated for the 7th of December. And this was the third attempt to remove him from office. So 2 prior votes to impeach him had already failed to get the mandatory 87 votes required to remove him from office, but it looked more and more as if, given corruption scandals that were coming to light and so forth, the December vote to impeach might go through. But it's still, most people think there probably were not 87 votes all the same. But everybody in Peru already knew that Wednesday the 7th's political outlook was shaky and uncertain at best. So anyway, around noon on Wednesday, December 7th, with the vote to impeach slated for 3 p.m. that day, Castillo took to the airwaves and read a statement that he was dissolving Congress and would govern by fiat until such time as a new Congress and constitutional changes could be put into effect. And he called for curfews and other measures in order to complete what would have to be called an autogolpe or self-coup due to his issuing an unconstitutional order such as this. As it happened, Congress moved swiftly, taking as read the assumption that they declined to be dissolved and no longer recognized Castillo as president. Castillo was taken into custody within a matter of hours, and the vote to impeach him was held early, and it was near unanimous with only 6 votes against and 10 abstaining. At this point, Castillo's vice president, Dina Boluarte, was sworn in as the new president. During the time that this was happening, the military also came out and said that they did not back Castillo in this play. So anyway, at least 4 other Latin American countries still at this point do not recognize Dina Boluarte as the legitimate president. But wealthy countries with a lot of global power strongly feel, wealthy countries with a lot of global power have recognized her as being such. However, a lot of people in Peru strongly feel that they should never have been impeachment proceedings brought against Castillo in the first place, and that if he had been a Lima insider, he would not have faced them, and also that this represents attempts by Congress to seize more power. It's worth noting that Congress has something like a 17, that is 17% approval rate, like 83% of the population would like to see new congressional elections and does not support this Congress. So this is a key point to mention. So anyway, so people who hold the belief that Castillo would not have been impeached at all if he were a Lima insider, and that's up for debate, feel that new elections should be called immediately. The Constitution specifies 270 days at minimum to call a new election, along with specific terms of specific spans of time that it takes to get ready for a new election cycle that takes 270 days. And so they say that the soonest that it could possibly be done would be April 2024. And then that is sort of where things stand right now. People who hold the belief that Congress is the one conducting the coup and has seized power illegally tend to believe that the new elections need to happen much sooner. And so April of 2024 is not soon enough for many people, and neither is December of 2023, which has also been put forth. But there's a lot of debate as to what can be done. So for people who feel that Congress conducted the coup and put Boluarte in charge, potentially with hopes that she would be removed from office or would have to step down, and then the president of Congress would take office, we'll come back to that some other time. They feel that it is absolutely essential that they need to get out and be protesting. So anyway, normally the next elections would be in 2026. So 2024 is moving them up, but not as much as people would like. And it is not elections for a new Congress either at that time. So there's a whole lot of debate happening in the Peruvian government about exactly what elections will happen when, who will take what office, who stays there, who is in charge, basically. So anyway, the Peru is a deeply divided country from a political perspective right now, where one set of people strongly feels that justice has been served and everything will be fine if everybody just stops protesting, and the people who are protesting feel strongly that it is their obligation to protest what they see as over a year of obstructionism that prevented Castillo from achieving pretty much anything of his campaign platform. So the people who are protesting nationwide are generally from what are considered the lower social classes, who are less wealthy, less educated in some cases, and who are typically of indigenous Andean descent. However, there are some allegations being made of outside agitators organizing these protests, and some allegations that they may be old terrorist groups that had gone to ground but are now resurfacing. So what protesters generally want is for Boluarte to resign as president, new elections to be called immediately, and Congress and the constitutional changes that have been under discussion through a number of presidential regimes over the past 6 or 7 years, and arguably before that as well, to be put into effect. Protesters are also motivated by feeling that Lima has not treated outlying regions well throughout basically history. With 8 protesters already dead, actually that number, when I wrote this post that I'm reading, trying to get up here, anyway, with over 25 protesters already dead and lots of injured, including police, and a lot of civil unrest, the situation's pretty volatile and uncertain, and it's unclear what at this point would roll things back to a state of not being in conflict. The present government feels, as do many of their supporters, that increased police presence and activity will bring the unruly in line, while protesters feel they should not be answerable to a government they don't recognize. Major roads and smaller roads have been blocked all over the country. Protesters have been going really hard in Lima. A lot of this is under control for the time being, and also in some other southern provinces in Peru, like where I live. I would say that protests in Cusco, where I live, have mostly been constant and vocal and loud, but there has been some damage to property, a lot of which people here tend to think is looters taking advantage or instigators who are not from the local populations and so forth. The airport in Cusco was closed for quite some time and just reopened. The strikes and protests are supposed to be indefinite and continue, and so there's no clear sense when those will end or how pronounced they're going to be. So a number of regional governments, perhaps notably Cusco, have issued statements suggesting ways to move forward and bring the unrest to a close, but it's not clear yet whether the present regime in power is interested in hearing those or open to negotiation, and many people feel that we don't know the whole story about what's going on, and we may never, and so where people fall along the lines of supporting the present government or not is also potentially variable. All in all, it's hard to say how this will shake out and by exactly when, but it may be likely to leave feelings of division along race and class lines, as well as urban and rural lines, much more entrenched and prone to future unrest. I would caution people in other countries, especially the USA, against trying to interpret these events through the lens of USA politics, because things are very different here. I would also suggest trying not to form a clear opinion without having read or heard at least 5 different perspectives from different political positions, and also to bear in mind that Latin America at large is not always keen on the idea of foreign intervention in domestic politics, because historically that has not always gone favorable for Latin American people. So if you found this interesting and informative, please let me know. There is a lot that is left out of this summary, which is intended to be brief and concise, and even-handed, and not to suggest that one side of these events has the moral high ground versus another. And if you're interested in having an argument about it, I encourage you to do so in your own spaces, and not invite me. I don't need to be a part of that. Again, this is 20 minutes trying to bring people as quickly as possible up to speed, as neutrally as possible on what's going on in Peru. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.